and welcome to Literary Hype. I am Stephanie, your literary hype woman, and I have an author conversation that I have been wanting to do for months, and it finally got to happen, and I'm so excited. I first met Evelyn Skye at Emerald City Comic Con back in March of 2023, and at that point she was promoting two books. Those books are both now out in the world. That is The Hundred Loves of Juliet and Damsel, which is going to be a Netflix movie. These are very different books, but both so good, and I could not wait to talk to her about the creation of both of these different worlds. So without any further ado, here's my conversation with Evelyn Skye. Welcome to Literary Hype. It is so exciting to have you on after meeting you way back in March for the first time, and now we get to talk about two books. You've got Damsel and The Hundred Loves of Juliet that came out this year. First off, what's it like for you putting out two books in 1 year?
So it's actually three, because in between those two, I put out a middle grade with Disney. So this year has been absolute bananas, but like in the best way. And at the same time, I was writing the next book for Disney for next year, and also my next adult fiction, which I just turned in a couple of weeks ago. So it's been just nonstop, but amazing, because I had actually a lull for a couple years before this, where like we were dealing with some family health problems, which I'm sure we'll get into because that has to do with The Hundred Loves of Juliet. But then after things settled down and everyone was healthy again, it was like the I don't know, the floodgates opened and all my creativity just rushed out. And so in 360 days, I had 4 books published, because then last year around this time was 3 Kisses, 1 Midnight with Roshni Chokshi and Sandhya Menon. So it's been amazing.
What a year for you, just with all of this going on. So let's start with the most recent release, The Hundred Loves of Juliet. So for anybody who has not already heard about this book or seen it on social media, can introduce us to what's going on in this story.
So this is contemporary fiction with a little bit of magic. So the idea is, what if Shakespeare got it wrong and Romeo never died, but Juliet did? And she's been reincarnated over and over. And in every lifetime, he finds her, they fall in love, but then he has to watch her die again. And so it's a tragic cycle again and again. But then now in modern day, when we meet the new Juliet, Helene, she refuses to believe in their tragedy. So the question is, can they finally break the cycle this time?
This is such an emotional story, especially like the Pearl Harbor vignette at the beginning. I was like, oh no, I know where this is going. No. So what was it like for you writing this book that is so emotional and kind of brutal at points?
It was interesting because there's 2 levels of the story. There's just the enjoying the book version, and then there was a very personal layer beneath for me. But we'll take kind of like the story version first, which, like, if you don't know like the underlying personal parts of it, it's still a great read, I think. So the story follows Romeo and Juliet mostly in modern day. They start in Alaska, where Romeo now goes by Sebastian Montague, and he's a king crab fisherman. He has hidden himself away in remote Alaska, basically so that Juliet will never find him again, because he has it in his head that it's his fault. Every time he meets her, that's when the curse starts. So he thinks that if he leaves her alone, then it will be okay and she can actually live a full life. So he's over there in Alaska, where the ratio of men to women is, much more heavily in the men column. And so he thinks that this is great because there will be no Juliet. But of course, fate has other plans, right? And so she is fleeing a disastrous marriage, and she has always written these little stories, short stories in her life, just little kind of happy love stories, meet cutes. But she's a historical fiction nerd, so they're little stories throughout history. And so she's running away from this, on the brink of divorce. And she thinks, I'm going to go to the farthest place I can find and rent a little cabin and have nothing else to do, and just finally figure out how these short stories connect, because I swear it could be a novel. And so she's going to write her book now, finally. And being in Alaska in the middle of January seems the perfect place, because it's cold outside, and she's a Southern California girl. So she figures she will be locked in and she'll have to write her story. When she gets there, she goes to a bar the first night, and she sees Sebastian, And she recognizes him immediately because he is exactly how she's always imagined the main character in her stories to look like. And so she goes up to him and she says, I know you. And he looks at her, and for a moment, there's a glimmer of recognition. And then he completely shuts down and he storms past her and he says, You're making a mistake. And he leaves and flees to the parking lot. And she's just like, What the heck just happened? First of all, she feels like she's written this guy into life, right? Like, how is this fictional character who started out as Romeo when she was in middle school and then became, because she was lazy or because she wasn't that creative with making character faces. Every single short story she ever wrote featured this guy. He basically grew up with her, was her best friend, and she kind of fell in love with him. He was like the book boyfriend she created, but now he's here. So then we switch perspective to Sebastian, who's Romeo, and he's in the parking lot and he's banging his head against the steering wheel of his truck because he knows the truth. He's actually Romeo who has never died, and she's Juliet. And so the story follows them here in the modern day, but also there's flashbacks, as you're talking about. There's like Pearl Harbor, they're at Versailles. We see all of their past lives together and how they fall in love every time. And we see the stories through their different lenses because Helene, the modern day Juliet, she's been writing these short stories just as kind of meet cutes. And so she always sees the beginning where it's so sweet and they're passionate and they fall madly in love right away. And then you later see a flashback from Sebastian's point of view where he knows the real story and he always focuses on the ending and how she always dies. So that is the story level. This book is also really personal. Like I said, my husband and I fell madly in love with each other, and he's basically like a book boyfriend come true. Our first date was literally at a bookstore, and then 18 months later, he proposed at that same bookstore. And the booksellers actually brought us champagne. They were so excited when he stopped by to drop off the flowers to say, Hey, I'm going to bring here as a surprise. And they said, oh my gosh, we have champagne too. So it's just incredible. But then he got really sick just 10 months after we were married. And it's a very rare, incurable disease. His lungs were the literary analogy is his lungs were turning into stone. The healthy tissue was turning into scar tissue, which means it can't process oxygen anymore. And so he was diagnosed in February of that year. And by August, he was in the hospital on life support because his lungs weren't working anymore. So it was very likely that he was going to die because there was no actual cure for it. The only possible cure was a lung transplant. And, that just depends on whether you find a match or not. And so he was in the hospital for a total of 6 weeks, very serious life support, where they were taking the blood out of his body, putting it through a machine to put oxygen in the blood, and then pumping the blood back into his body because his lungs were just done. And we got a call one night that there were lungs, and we thought that was it. But then when the surgical team went down to see the actual organs, they said that they were too boggy and they didn't want to implant these lungs into my husband's chest. And so it was so devastating to get that hope and then have it taken away. But at the same time, understanding that, his doctors wanted the best for him, right? Like they want him to be able to live. So we waited, and I think it was like another week or so. His condition was fast deteriorating because you can't be on those machines, the life support machines, for very long before it starts affecting your health overall when you already basically have no health. But then we got another call for another donor, and it was a perfect match, and the lungs were great and the surgery was a success. Everything went so well. And only afterwards did the doctors tell us that they thought he only had like maybe 2 or 3 more days to live. So if we hadn't gotten that call for those lungs then, I would have lost him. So for me, that's the very personal side of this story. I had come up with the idea for the Romeo and Juliet, like immortal Romeo reincarnated Juliet, years ago, but it was just the plot. And it felt like there was something really missing. Like there was a soul to the story that was missing. So I set the idea aside thinking like, well, I'll come back to it at some point when it feels right. And after my husband and I went through this, that was the soul, right? Like now I understood what it was like to love someone so entirely, but then know that you're going to lose them, but then have that second chance, right? So when he got his lung transplant, like we are so thankful for his donor and the donor's family, because through their horrible tragedy, they also gave us a gift of life, right? And to other people as well. And so that is my husband's reincarnation in my mind, and now we live every day very aware of that gift. And it makes all the little things not matter. The little things you pick fights with in normal relationships, all of a sudden it's like, I don't care if you put the bowls in the dishwasher wrong. Like, I will be so happy to have you for as many years as I can with the bowls in the wrong place. I'll just move them. Not a big deal. So when I initially wrote this story and my agent was sending it out to editors, the editor, Anne Grohl, who eventually bought the book, she loved the idea. But at that point, I hadn't gone deep enough emotionally. Like, I'd put some of it in there, but I had my walls up. I was protecting my own heart. And so I'd written it still kind of, it wasn't rom-com, but it was like somewhere like rom-com, but with just a little bit more, maybe like an Emily Henry book, like rom-com, but with some emotional weight to it. And this editor, Anne, she said to me, I love the idea of this book. I think it'd be great as it is, but then it wouldn't be the book for me. But if you want to work with me, I would love to help you dive deeper, but you're going to have to open yourself up and be raw and touch those vulnerable parts. And I knew that that was what this book really needed. I needed someone to help me guide me to those very, very scary places. And she did it. She's such a gentle editor. And I think together, like through several rounds of revision, we were able to open up all those emotional layers inside of me that I was too afraid to face. And that's why I think that The Hundred Loves of Juliet is very emotionally resonant, because it is very true. It's not just about an immortal guy who falls in love with a girl who happens to come back to life. There's real love and pain and loss associated with it. That being said, it is actually a optimistic, hopeful book, even though it sounds so tragic, because Helene, the new Juliet, she's an incorrigible optimist, which I am too. You can't stop me from seeing silver linings. And so I needed the book in the end to still be hey, this is how we celebrate love right now. And this is how we live together and enjoy this life that we're given.
You've called this book Your Whole Soul. So
Mm-hmm.
what's it like for you to put something that is so personal out for public consumption?
It was really exciting at first to feel like I could share this message of love, because my husband Tom and I, we have such an extraordinary relationship that I feel like it's really important to me to bring hope and joy to the world. Like, that's actually one of my personal missions, like joy and kindness. And I want people to know that these kinds of love stories can be real. It's not just in books, because I think often we allow ourselves to settle in real life because we think like, well, that's nice for the stories, but me personally, I'm not going to meet this person. And this is something that Helene in the book, she's kind of grappling with too. She realizes that in her first relationship, in her marriage, she didn't actually think she deserved more than that. And so that's what she settled for, which reminds me of a line from Perks of Being a Wallflower, I think. Like, I can't remember the quote right now, but like, we accept the love that we think we deserve, something like that. But it's that same kind of concept, right? And I feel like it's the same way for me, in that my husband is the biggest romantic, and he says to me some of the things that people would think are so corny. And this is what Sebastian does to Helene. And she realizes that we often roll our eyes at those kinds of things in life because we don't necessarily think that we would deserve them. But when someone actually genuinely says them to you, you feel like a queen. Like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. So I was really excited to share that message with the world. And then on release day, I put out a story on a reel on Instagram and a video on TikTok about the true inspiration beneath this book, basically what I just shared with you, but just in a shorter video form. And that just blew up. It went bananas. Like, as of this morning on TikTok, the video had over 1 million views already. And so that was, my husband his mind was blown, like, wow, like 1 million people. We can't even fathom really what that means, have seen our story. And that makes us really happy. And at the same time, all of a sudden last night, like after this TikTok video had been out for like 6 days, 5 days, 6 days, I started feeling like, okay, I'm an introvert and now I'm kind of ready for this story to be mine again, which is, I can't put the genie back in the bottle, right? Like, it's out there. The book is out there. The videos are out there. But it's been really interesting that something that was such a very intimate love story for just me and my husband and our family is now out there for everyone. But I think that ultimately, if it brings people, that sense of hope and understanding for love, and I've also had people who read advanced copies tell me that they were going through their own grief. They had lost someone when they were reading my book, and that it helped them get through that. If that's what this story can do, I'm so happy for it to be out there in the world.
And you talked about getting the spark for this long before, and kind of retellings are really having a moment now. What was it back in the past that sparked your interest in writing this Romeo and Juliet retelling?
So I loved Shakespeare when I was in high school. I had this great British literature teacher, and she taught Shakespeare in a way that was not only like, let's read the original Shakespeare, but also how can the students, the teenagers, make this story their own. And so she encouraged us to take Hamlet and rewrite it. And so me and my friends, we did a group project and we wrote Hamlet with vampires, because at that point I was in love with Anne Rice. That was, the height of Interview with a Vampire. It was before the movie. Like, don't even get me into the casting choices for the original movie. And I mean, I really at that point in my life thought that I was going to be a vampire. In the back of my closet door, I had a Halloween sign. I think it looked like one of those construction signs, but it had a bat on it, so it's like bat crossing. And I was so ready, any day, unless that was going to come for me. So anyway, we wrote Hamlet with vampires. So I think that from the very start of my education and introduction to Shakespeare, I've always thought that they were stories that were malleable, that you could play with. And because Shakespeare, his works are just, they're so famous, they're so pervasive in our culture that if there've been so many retellings, there's not as much need to stick specifically to the original story. And Romeo and Juliet actually wasn't his story, right? Like, that story had already been told by other bards, and then he became the bard, and his version became the most famous. So it was really fun to pick that one to play around with. And the other thing is, Romeo and Juliet is one of the greatest love stories of all time, except it's so sad. And I don't like being a sad person. And I wanted to be able to give Romeo and Juliet a chance to maybe be happy.
I will admit that I learned something about Romeo and Juliet through this book that I really should have known. I share a birthday with Juliet, and I did not know until I read this book.
Really? July 31st, huh?
Yeah.
Lana's Eve.
I read that and I was like, wait, what? And I Googled it and I was like, how did I not know this?
Amazing. Well, now I will never forget your birthday.
It's the best.
Yeah.
Well, and it coincides with the release of the book because this came out on August 1st. Was that intentional, or was that just an accident?
No. So it was really interesting because this book was originally supposed to come out in February. Like, I've been done with this book for so long, but then I also wrote Damsel, and it's the same publisher, or it's like they're divisions of the exact same publisher. And so they wanted Damsel to come out in the spring, about 6 months before the movie would come out on Netflix. And so because of that, then 100 Loves got bumped to August. And because I wrote 100 Loves first, and then the Netflix deal just kind of happened, and that timeline was, faster, and there's the film, so that was not in our control. So we had to sync that schedule up with that one. So that's how that happened. Yeah, but no, August 1st, July 31st, total coincidence.
It's just perfection.
Yeah. Happy birthday to you.
I love it. Here for it. There are so many other historical details in this book through the little vignettes that Helene is writing. How much research did you have to put into it to get these little bitty snippets of the past correct?
So I love historical fiction. So I've read so much historical fiction, and my major in undergrad was Russian history, which is not super relevant here. It's relevant to the first book I wrote, which was about the first two books I wrote, which was set in a period of Russia. But I just love history. So I'm always devouring stories and nonfiction. Just like, articles about history are one of my favorite things. So there's a lot of foundational knowledge in my head. And so when I was writing, I write chronologically. So I write from the very beginning of the story to the end. And so I would be writing the present day, and I'd think, oh, you know what? I feel like this is a time for a flashback now, or one of Helene's vignettes in the past. So I would just write it without worrying about the history as the first draft, right? Like, just lay down what I think I know about it. And then it was later in revision that then I would go through and do some more research, And so there's really interesting details that sometimes happen during my own revision, and then sometimes later in the editorial process in copy editing. For example, in the Switzerland story where Sebastian is Felix Montague and he's a clockmaker. I had him working on a grandfather clock, but it turns out that at that time period, grandfather clocks did not exist yet. The technology did not exist yet, which to me is just mind blowing, right? Because it seems like what's so basic, but of course we're talking hundreds of years ago. And so then I had to go and do research on old clocks and found out that monstrance clocks will work, right? So that was kind of like a precursor to grandfather clocks, but they tended to be in the church, but they're kind of big and decorative. And so I find I learn history sometimes through my research after I'm backing up the stuff that I've just made up in my first drafts.
I was going to ask about what order you wrote this in and if you plotted or pants. Because if you said that you pantses, I was not going to believe you. Like, it's so well, these little stories of the past are so well woven into the entire story. So kind of talk about that process of building up these historical and like deciding what points of history you wanted to include Romeo and Juliet in.
I write chronologically, but I do outline first. So I used to be a pantser, but no more because pantsing has given me so many problems where I'll turn in books and then my editor will say like the first 25% is great. And then I have to throw away the next 75% and rewrite it. And then the next time she's like 50% of that is great. And so I throw another chunk away. So it just takes longer when I don't outline. So I've learned to kind of loosely outline and then allow myself to be organic in the process as I'm filling that out and writing the actual manuscript so it still feels true. And I usually deviate from the outline a little bit or sometimes a lot, but at least there's more of a structure, you know, than if I'm just going from scratch and nothing. So when I was outlining, that's really where my brainstorming process starts. And so I do chapter by chapter outline. And so I start, you know, I was like, okay, this is present day, this is this scene, this is this scene. And then often, you know, sometimes it's just a pacing question, like, oh, we've gone like 4 or 5 chapters and we're still in the present. So maybe it's time for a past flashback. And it would often be a gut feeling like, okay, right now they're having this conflict. And so I need to give it more flavor and a little more depth, you know, to their relationship. Why is Sebastian feeling so strongly at this moment? Oh, it's because in the past, you know, here's this moment when Romeo first saw Juliet at the Capulet Manor, or he's at sea and it's a stormy sea and he's thinking about Pearl Harbor when he was also, you know, in charge of a crew and it was dangerous. So that was kind of how those became so well integrated because I tried to listen to where the story was going or what the characters needed. And then in terms of history, I kept a timeline. So I have a timeline and I know every single life of Juliet and how long she lived in each of those lives, starting from the original Juliet to modern day. And so I made sure that I was jumping around significantly throughout history so that we weren't only in the 1800s or only in the 1400s, you know, because I wanted to be able to show their love throughout time. But obviously I think the book is like 316, something like that pages. I'm not sure exactly how many. I know it's 336 if you count extra blank pages, but I don't know how many pages have real story in them. But you can't fit every single one of Juliet's lives, right, in that many pages. So I know what they were, but you all don't know what they were.
Are you ever going to release that as like bonus content?
So I am actually going to release a redacted version of the timeline without their names and identities and places, but like of like their actual lives. So that will be on my newsletter. So evelynskye.substack.com for anyone who wants to subscribe. I'm going to be releasing bonus content throughout the next few weeks. And if you subscribe later, there's access to the archives. So I'm going to do that timeline. There's this great restaurant in the book called Axes and S'more, where you get to throw axes, but then they also have these massive platters of s'mores. And there's like regular s'mores, but then there's Hawaiian s'mores with like pineapple marshmallows. And then there's Elvis s'mores that come with peanut butter and bacon and that kind of thing. So I'm going to release the full menu for that because I have such a sweet tooth. And so I had this entire menu with over 24 platters of different kinds of s'mores. And in an early version, when my agent read it, she was like, this is super fun, but it slows the pacing down. And I don't think people need to know 24 or more types of s'mores. I was like, I mean, I need to know. But anyway, that will be in the bonus content. And then I'm actually also going to release the original ending to the book, which my editor did not like. And I agree with her. And so that one, I'm going to wait a little bit to make sure people have had time to read the book, because obviously it's a major spoiler. But I think that'll be interesting. And I'll be so curious to hear people's opinions on which one they like better or how they prefer the story to end.
You've also got a playlist for this book.
Oh, yeah.
It's not to create, and like, how important is music to your writing process?
So this is a really hilarious question because I have to write in complete silence. So a lot of authors, their publisher will say, "Hey, do you have a playlist? What do you listen to?" And I'm like, "Would you like a playlist of nothing?" Because literally, if my husband's on a conference call, I've got earplugs in. So this playlist I did afterwards, and it is inspired by the feeling of the book. So it's all about like yearning and second chances and missed opportunities, and it's all those like beautiful love songs that kind of like really make you feel like right here in the center of your chest, a little bit of ache and a lot of want. And yeah, so I love that playlist. It's on Spotify. It's on my link tree if you're on my social media, and it's also on my newsletter archive, so you can check it out there.
One of the things that stood out to me about this book, like when I got this at the Arc at Emerald City, and I started reading it while sitting in line for David Tennant. And I was so absorbed in this because of the lush writing. And that's one of those phrases where I'm like, you always hear people say like, it's so lush or sparkling. And you're like, what does that even mean? This one, lush is the word that comes to mind. Your descriptions are so beautiful and intense and just takes your brain away. Does description come easy to you, or is that something you have to really work on when you're writing your books?
Description comes relatively easily. The hardest part for me is plot and making sure that the plot is still moving. So that outlining phase is really the hardest for me. When in terms of writing, like thank you so much for saying that about my prose. It means so much to me because I hear the sentences kind of like music when I'm writing them. And so there's a rhythm to them. And I whisper them out loud to myself. This is an embarrassing confession. I whisper act in my office. So especially dialogue, I will act out the characters myself when I pull all sorts of faces. And if I'm in a coffee shop, I don't even want to know what people think about me because the faces that I'm making. But I actually have a problem with my vocal cords caused by whispering, because whispering is apparently like the worst thing you can do for your vocal cords because you're not allowing them to fully vibrate. You're kind of just pushing air through them without letting them do what they're supposed to do. So I will often think I'm getting sick, but then I'll realize it's because I've just been intensely revising a scene and whispering the dialogue back and forth. But so I do this with basically all of my prose too when I'm writing, and I will notice like, okay, this sentence sounds right, almost right, but it seems to be missing like two beats, and so I will keep playing with it and playing with it. And sometimes I'll end up playing with a sentence for, a good 10, 20 minutes, just trying to get that rhythm correct. And unlike a lot of writers, words are the most important to me. Not that other writers don't care about words, but a lot of people, when they're writing, they're seeing a movie in their head and they're transcribing what's happening in the movie onto the page. And I actually don't see the faces of my characters. They're kind of blurred out. So I know their like general characteristics, physical characteristics, but like I can't really, really see their faces. So if you ask me about fan casting, I don't have actors in my head already. Like I just don't. But I see the words. I literally see words kind of like floating in the air as I'm writing. And so I'm very, very visual, literally visual about my words.
You are not alone on reading your work out loud.
Oh, good.
Other authors have told me that they will full on perform it for their partners with accents. So you are good.
Oh, wow. That's ballsy. I don't think I could do that.
It helps you really understand what you're trying to do and if it's working. Yes. And with that, you're talking about like seeing a movie in your head. We've got your other book that we can talk about. But for those watching, we are going to be a little more vague on some of the details because of the strikes that are going on. So you mentioned Damsel. So talk a little bit about how this book came to be.
So this was wild because I was just happily writing my other 3 books, and then my agent emailed me and said, "Hey, Netflix would like you to write this book for Milie Bobby Brown's movie. Are you interested? Are you interested? But we know Evelyn's super busy, so it's okay if she says no." I was like, yes, drop everything. Yes, that was, yeah, like I said, just wild. That came out of nowhere. for me. And I guess the process was that my publisher, already had the Hundred Loves of Juliet from me kind of in the works in terms of editorial and all that. And they have a wing which used to be part of Del Rey. It's now called Random House Worlds, which does other licensing. So like Star Wars, Minecraft, Dungeons and Dragons. Well, they also work with Netflix with Stranger Things and things like that. And so Netflix, the filmmakers on the Damsel team are all big actual fantasy book nerds. And so they really wanted to have a book that was a companion to the movie. But not only that, they wanted this book to not be a straight adaptation. They didn't want someone to just take the existing screenplay and transcribe it into a book. They wanted someone to take this world and expand it, expand the world, expand the characters, expand the magic and the lore in a way that you can do in 400 pages that you can't do it for a 90-minute movie. And so when they approached me for that, again, I don't know, my publisher must have been talking to them internally. I think they said, here's a list of authors that we think you might like. And I have no idea why they chose me, but I'll take it. They said, we want you to do whatever you want with the story. You just have to stick with the core story that's in the screenplay. But after that, you can basically do whatever you want. And so I said, yeah, let's do it. And I immediately thought, I want a dragon language for the dragon. And my daughter is a linguistic genius. She was 13 at the time. Her mind is just like, I don't even understand how it works. And so I said, hey, can you make a dragon language for me? And she's like, yeah, I guess so. And so she just does it, and all I did was help her put things into a form that looks like a grammatical textbook, because at this point, she's 13, right? She doesn't like organize things as well, maybe as needs to be for publishing. So I'm like, let's, well, where are your verb conjugations? Okay, so this is the table. Let's put it like this. And so I would just ask her, like, what's this conjugation? What's this conjugation? So in the back of Damsel, we have a guide for the actual like pronunciation, the syntax, the verb conjugations. There's an abridged dictionary for English to the dragon language and dragon language and back. And yeah, so in the book, the dragon, all the things that the dragon says, they're real. It's a real language. And then she actually recorded all the dialogue for the audiobook narrator, because you can't have a 13-year-old girl doing the dragon's, voice, but the narrator needed to know how to pronounce everything, right? And my daughter Reese is literally the expert on the planet in this language. So she does the recordings in her like adorable little 13-year-old voice. And then the narrator took them and made them dragony. So that was amazing.
And what's your daughter's reaction to being a part of this whole world now?
She so doesn't care. She does not care.
Teenagers.
I know. She's like, okay, to her, it's not a big deal that her mom writes books, right? Because I've done it for so much of her life. My first book was published, I think, when she was 7. And so basically for like all of her real existing memories, this is what mom has done. And so now she made a language, which also to her is no big deal because she's just good at that kind of stuff. But no big deal, made a language, it went into mom's book and like, whatever.
So many people would be so jealous of this opportunity.
I think her friends are more impressed than she is. Because her friends are like, this is a movie with Milie. And she's like, yeah.
I love it so much. But it's also like good that it's not going to her head and developing complex.
Like, she loves reading, but she's not that into writing or anything. She's a math and science girl. And so it's just background to her. And she's so modest. And she has no desire to be, famous in any even small way. So when I showed her that her name was actually on the title page, it says Dragon Language by Evelyn Skye. She kind of like, I was like, Mom, why'd you do that? Now people are going to know.
It's so opposite of like the culture that a lot of kids are growing up in, of like you change fate, and to have a kid who just like whatever is really refreshing and lovely.
It's so refreshing. Thank you. I think part of it too, it's part of her core personality. She's always just been very modest. She doesn't love a lot of attention, even if she does amazing things. But also she has been my Instagram videographer and photographer for years now. And so she sees how much goes into it. And so she realizes how not real social media is, right? Like, oh yeah, mom posted this one picture. It looks great. I literally took like 300 pictures that day.
Kids, gotta love them. They keep us real,
Yeah,
right?
for sure.
With Damsel, did you get the screenplay ahead of time and then kind of have to figure out what you wanted to build from, or how much of the original dialogue did you kind of keep to and build off of with that?
So I did get the original screenplay. I don't know if, I think it might have been a second draft. I'm not sure what draft they're on. It was still pretty early in the filmmaking process when I got the screenplay. And so I based my outline off of that. And so that's why the core story is the same. But then they still were doing revisions on the screenplay, and I needed to write the book, right? Because at some point we had to make the movie and get the book done, so we couldn't just keep checking in with each other. And so because Netflix was so amazing and truly wanted this book to be its own thing and had given me permission to change things if I needed to from the movie in order to make it make sense in the book, I was able to diverge a little bit from the screenplay, actually a lot in some places, but you'll have to wait and see what those differences are. But yeah, so that's kind of how it started. And that's why, the basis is the same. If you read the book now, you'll see a lot of familiar things in the movie. When I was on the set in London, actually, they were filming a scene that hadn't changed from very much from the early version of the screenplay, and so was also nearly identical in the book. So that was a lot of fun because I recognized it.
So you mentioned that you were working on some other books for the future. Can you tell us anything about those at this point?
I don't think I'm allowed to. I can say that the adult fiction that's coming out next year, I believe in either late summer or early fall, we don't have a specific release date yet, will be a really good follow-up to Juliet. It has that same kind of feel in terms of being contemporary, but with just that little hint of magic in the background. And it's a love story because honestly, my books always have love stories. It's just the way that they are. And I think that's all I'm allowed to say. I'm waiting for the cover art. And so I'm really excited about that. So here's a funny story. Remember, I told you that I don't see characters' faces. And when I'm writing, it's really about who the people are. It doesn't really matter to me as much what their physical descriptions are. It's like that's a necessary thing that I have to build in, right? And so my editor said, hey, the art department is starting to work on the cover for your next book. Just so you can help them out a little bit, we might be doing silhouettes. We might be like playing around with like, just them as characters on the cover, like who knows what they come up with. But she said, can you give us just like a rundown of their physical characteristics? What do they look like? I was like, what do they look like? This is a very good question. I literally had to go back into my own manuscript, like, oh yeah, right. She's 5'4". I remember that because I'm 5'4". So I made her 5'4" because that was like, a height differential that I could understand. And like he's like 6 foot or something like that, I think, because that's my husband's 6'1", right? And so when you're working out the mechanics of like, how do you kiss someone? How does this situation look when they're next to each other? It kind of helps if you have somebody else in your life you can stand next to and be like, hey, can you do this thing for me? And let's see if it works. But anyway, that's what I can say about the next book. And then I have another Disney middle grade coming out next year as well. It's like a princess detective series. It's super cute.
So will your adult book continue the emotional torture that you're inflicting upon
Yes,
us?
basically, yes, indeed. I apologize and I don't apologize.
Okay. What do you know about writing now that you wish you knew when you wrote your first book?
Ooh, that's a good question. First of all, outline, don't pants. I know it works for some people. It just does not work for me. I think the other thing, this one I'm going to steal from my friend Roshni Chakshi because we were just talking about this the other day. And when you're coming out with a first book, your debut novel, which for most of us is not the first thing we've ever written, right? So like I wrote 8 entire manuscripts before I actually got published. So my first book was actually my 9th manuscript. But there's this pressure sometimes, especially in a world where like social media and everything is always moving so fast and people's attention seems so short, to feel like you have to be huge right away or else your career's over. And that's definitely not true because my first book was published in 2016. I've been through ups and downs. Like I've had books do really, really well, and books are, I'm not sure if people know that they exist, and then I had that personal lull where I wasn't writing and we were just kind of hunkered down as a family dealing with my husband's sickness. And then now I'm back with, 4 books in 360 days. And so I think it's, you should know that your career is long, and that if you're a writer, you have that time. Like the words and the storytelling are always with you, and sometimes you just need to be patient, and life happens, careers happen. Careers are long term. It's not only ever about one book, it's about creating this entire body of work. And so back to what Roshni said, she said to me, I'm going to try to do this without the emphatic, charming expletive, is she said, if you build a castle in one day or 1 year, it's still a frickin' castle. Right. And I think you can expand that to, like, if you do build it in 1 year or 10 years, it's still a frickin' castle. And I love that so much. And even this far into my career, the Hundred Loves of Juliet is my 8th book, and I've already turned in books 9 and 10 for next year. I still need that reminder sometimes because you forget.
How important is the writing community to you and keeping moving forward with your career?
The writing community is so incredibly important. Like, writers are the best. Readers and writers are the best. And for me, I need both communities, and they serve different purposes, like, because I'm a huge reader. So I love being part of the reading community. But writing is, so I started in YA. And so I grew up with that community, which was just so welcoming, and everyone was so supportive of each other, especially when you're debuting. You have these groups that are your debut groups. So I had the big 2016 debut group, but also like a smaller group that was, what were we called? I don't think we were 2K16. No, Sweet 16. Well, anyway, Sweet 16 was a big group. I don't know, I forget. But with this group of 20 debut authors, and we're all working together to try to cross promote each other's books and share opportunities, and like, hey, maybe we can put together this panel for this conference. And it's just, you create these friendships of people who are going through the same thing, who are dreaming the same big dreams, and you're helping each other, and it's really incredible. And then even now, whenever I go to Comic Cons, for example, I'm with Del Rey. Del Rey is just this amazing family. So the people who work there at the publisher, they all actually love each other. Like, they're joking around with each other all the time. They're so comfortable. They're working the booths at all the Comic Cons together. And the authors are the same. So I was at Phoenix Fan Fusion, and our publisher wasn't there, but there are other Del Rey authors there. And there are other authors as well. So I started out by hanging out with some of the YA people that I knew, like Kirsten White. And then I knew Delilah Dawson, who is with Del Rey from Emerald City Comic Con, where I met you. And so Delilah was also at Phoenix. And so I was like, hey, Delilah. And she's like, hey. And she's like, oh, hey, let me introduce you to some other Del Rey authors. And as soon as you mentioned your Del Rey, they're like, hey, get like the biggest hug. Pierce Brown gives the best hugs ever. And I adore him. And like, he doesn't know me, but now he does, like, so I met him at Phoenix just briefly. Then we were at San Diego together. And as soon as he saw me, huge hug. And I was like, I love you. He's like, it just made me so happy to see you. And I was like, why are you so nice? Like, you're so successful. You don't have to be nice, but he's like literally the sweetest guy. And it's the same with all these other authors. Like, I'm still learning from all of them, and just the warmth and the willingness to help each other out and talk about writing, not talk about writing. It's just amazing. So for sure, it's just the best community.
It's just, the writing community and Comic Cons are so much fun because, like, when you go to these events, you all automatically have people that love the same thing you do.
Yes.
It's just such a great community to get to be part of.
Yeah, the energy. Oh, I love Comic Cons. I had never done Comic Cons before for books until I was promoting Damsel and the Hundred Loves, because my previous publishers weren't at Comic Cons, but Del Rey that's their thing, right? And so it's amazing. I'm so in love with Comic Cons. I'm so glad I met you
too, because this is really fun. And both of your books are just so freaking good, man.
Oh, thank you.
God, I was like, even just from that first moment of reading it at Emerald City, I was like, I've got to get her on here. So it took a few months, but we made it happen.
We made it happen. I'm so glad we connected. You're a great interviewer. I think you covered everything.
Well, thanks. So we have one more question. And the last question is the most fun question. Since this is literary hype, what books are you hyped about right now?
Ooh, okay. So let's see. Here's some that I've read. Okay. So I just talked about Roshni Chakshi because she's one of my good friends. So The Last Tale of the Flower Bride. If you love lush writing, This is a book to savor. It's just, oh, it's so gorgeous. You can't read it all at once. If you try to read it all at once, it's like, it's too much. It's like going to a rich meal and trying to eat like the 15 course meal in like half an hour. So like this one's to savor. I love it. It's like a dark fairy tale of a marriage. And this is also her adult debut. So I love that one. Two more for you. So Other Birds, Sarah Addison Allen. This book is like Melrose Place on an adorable little island, I believe, off of South Carolina. It's a fictional island, and there's a little bit of magic, and it's just, I don't know how to describe it. You just have to read it. It's so good. And then this is my fantasy pick, which a lot of people don't know about this author and this book. It's The Kingdoms by Natasha Pulley. She is a British author, I believe. So we don't have as many British books over here, but this book is, oh my God, it's atmospheric and it's time travel and it's like mind bending and it's just so, so gorgeous. So if you're into fantasy and love stories and LGBTQ books, this is amazing, amazing, amazing.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks, Stephanie. Super fun. Thank you for LiteraryHypeWoman is like the coolest name ever, by the way.
It's very accurate to my personality.
Yeah, I love it.
Thanks to Evelyn for taking the time out of her day to talk about books with me. If you want to get a copy of The Hundred Loves of Juliet or Damsel, those links are down below, as well as where to find her on social media, how to subscribe to her newsletter, and that playlist that she was talking about for The Hundred Loves of Juliet. These books are so great. I so appreciate her talking to me about them and sharing these little behind the scenes details of creating a dragon language and what goes into that. It was so much fun. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel if you have not already done so. It really does mean a lot to me to have you along on this bookish journey with me. Until next time, see you later.